When 8-year-old Tommy Brennan fell into the water, there were hundreds of people at the festival, but they all just stood there screaming and shouting. Only one person moved. That person was the man the townspeople had feared for months, the mysterious guy they'd crossed the street to avoid, the one they'd pull their kids away from at the grocery store, Master Sergeant Luke Riker. But that day, everyone was about to learn who Luke Riker really was. He looked like any other broken soldier, until a child's life hung in the balance, and everyone saw what training never leaves behind. Master Sergeant Luke Riker wasn't supposed to be the hero of Little Creek, Montana. At 45, with graying temples and hands that trembled slightly when he thought no one was looking, he was just another casualty of wars that most folks preferred not to think about. The townspeople had their opinions about him, whispered behind grocery store aisles and over coffee at Mabel's Diner. "That's the one who lives up by Miller's Ridge," they'd say. "Ex-military. Something happened over there." They weren't wrong, but the details didn't matter to the people of Little Creek. All they saw was a man who bought his groceries at dawn to avoid crowds, who never made eye contact at the post office, and who lived alone in a cabin that used to belong to old Pete Miller. Every morning at 0500 hours, Riker would emerge from his cabin and disappear into the pine forest. He'd return 2 hours later, moving with measured pace. The mothers in town had taken to pulling their children closer when he passed, not because he'd ever done anything threatening, but because there was something about his stillness that made people uncomfortable. Every evening, Riker would sit on his porch and methodically sharpen a fixed-blade knife with movements so practiced they seemed meditative. It wasn't threatening, but in a town where the most dangerous thing most folks owned was a deer rifle, the sight made people nervous. The truth was, Luke Riker had been many things before he became the town's resident ghost story. He'd been a Delta Force operator, one of the best, trained to do things that would give ordinary people nightmares. But mostly, he'd been a protector. It was the one thing that hadn't changed, even after the discharge papers that cited PTSD and fitness for duty concerns. The people of Little Creek didn't know any of this. They just knew he was different, and different made them uncomfortable. It was a Sunday in late September when everything changed. The town had organized its annual harvest festival down by Willow Creek. Kids ran between booths selling funnel cakes and caramel apples, while their parents caught up on gossip. Riker hadn't been invited, of course. He'd been on his morning walk when the sounds of the festival drifted through the trees. For a moment he'd stopped and listened, something that might have been longing flickering across his weathered features. The sun was climbing toward noon when it happened. Below him, maybe 300 yards away, a crowd had gathered at the river's edge. Someone was shouting, their voice high and desperate. Riker's training kicked in before his conscious mind could catch up. Tommy Brennan had been trying to retrieve a balloon that had floated into the river. His mother, Sarah, had been distracted by conversation for maybe 30 seconds. In that brief window, Tommy had leaned too far over the water, lost his balance, and tumbled into Willow Creek. The river looked deceptively calm from a distance, but Riker knew better. The recent rains had swollen the creek, and the current was stronger than it appeared. Tommy was already being carried downstream, his small arms fighting against water that was indifferent to his struggle. "Somebody help him!" Sarah's voice cut through the festival noise like a blade. "Please, somebody help my son." The crowd was doing what crowds do in crisis situations, standing around shouting advice, hoping someone else would take action. But the river wasn't waiting for proper preparation. Riker was already moving. He came down that ridge like a man possessed, crashing through underbrush with the kind of speed that suggested he knew exactly where every root and branch would be. His boots hit the festival grounds at a dead run. "Coming through," he barked, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made people step aside without thinking. It was the first time most of them had heard him speak, and the command in his tone was unmistakable. At the river's edge, he made his assessment in the time it took most people to blink. Tommy was about 50 yards downstream now, still struggling, but visibly weakening. The current was carrying him toward a section where the creek bent sharply around fallen trees. Without hesitation, Riker reached into his pocket and pulled out a length of paracord, 550 cord, military grade, strong enough to support a man's weight. He always carried it, another habit from the old days. Riker tied one end of the cord around his waist and secured the other end to a sturdy oak tree. The knots were military precise, tied with the kind of muscle memory that comes from doing something 1,000 times in training. Then he was in the water. The crowd went silent. Riker's strokes were economical, powerful, each movement calculated to fight the river's pull. He reached Tommy just as the boy was beginning to panic. When Riker's hand closed around his wrist, the man's voice was calm, controlled, almost gentle. "Easy, son. I've got you. Just relax and let me do the work." Tommy looked into the stranger's eyes and saw something that made him stop struggling. Later, he would try to explain to his mother what he'd seen there, but he was only 8 and didn't have words for the kind of certainty that comes from a man who has pulled people from much worse situations. Getting back to shore was about training, muscle memory, and the kind of stubborn determination that had kept him alive in places where the water was dirty and the bullets were real. The paracord helped, giving him something to pull against when the current threatened to carry them downstream. When they reached the shore, Riker didn't stop to catch his breath. He lifted Tommy onto the bank and immediately began checking him for injuries, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. "He's okay," Riker announced to the crowd. "Might want to get him checked out by the doc, but he's fine." Sarah Brennan was crying, trying to hug her son, babbling thanks that seemed inadequate for what had just happened. And Luke Riker, soaking wet and still catching his breath, stood up and looked around at the faces staring back at him. For a moment, the silence stretched long enough to be uncomfortable. Then he nodded once, the way soldiers do when the job is done, and turned to walk away. "Wait," Sarah called after him. "Please, I don't even know your name." He paused, half turned back. "Luke. Luke Riker. Mr. Riker, how can I thank you?" "You don't need to." His voice was quiet again. "Just keep an eye on him near the water." Then he was walking away, leaving wet footprints on the festival grounds and a crowd of people who were seeing him clearly for the first time. The festival continued, but the mood had shifted. The man they'd been afraid of, the broken soldier who lived apart from their community, had just risked his life to save one of their children. That night, as Riker sat on his porch sharpening his knife in the fading light, he found himself thinking about the boy's eyes, the trust he'd seen there, the complete faith that this stranger would keep him safe. It was a feeling he'd almost forgotten. Being needed, being useful, being someone worth trusting. The next morning, he woke to find a thermos of coffee on his porch, still warm. A note attached. "Thank you, the Brennan family." Next to it, a child's drawing in crayon, a stick figure pulling another stick figure out of wavy blue lines. At the bottom, in the careful block letters of a second grader, "My hero." Riker stared at the drawing for a long time. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his pocket. The changes were subtle at first. Mrs. Henderson nodded when he passed her garden. Jim Patterson raised a hand in greeting when their paths crossed downtown. Kids still stared, but now it was with curiosity rather than fear. One morning, as Riker made his way to the general store, he noticed a small gathering outside. Mrs. Kowalski, the elderly store owner, was struggling with a heavy delivery of grain sacks. Without thinking, he approached and lifted the first sack onto his shoulder. The weight was nothing to him, but the gesture meant everything to the woman who had watched him from a distance for months. "Thank you, Mr. Riker," she said, her voice carrying genuine warmth. As he helped with the remaining sacks, other townspeople began to assist. And for the first time since his arrival, he found himself working alongside his neighbors, rather than apart from them. The following week, Riker was on his evening walk when he heard the sound of sobbing from the cemetery. Behind the weathered headstone of Corporal David Mitchell, beloved son, he found a young woman clutching a folded flag. She looked up at him with tear-stained cheeks and whispered, "You knew him, didn't you?" "My brother David." Riker's throat tightened. David had been one of his men, a kid from Montana who joined his unit 3 years ago. "He was a good soldier," Riker said quietly, settling beside her on the grass. "He saved lives." For the next hour, he told her stories about David's courage, his humor, his unwavering loyalty to his brothers in arms. When they finally parted, Jennifer Mitchell squeezed his hand and said, "He wrote about you in his letters, said you were the one who brought everyone home." That night, Riker sat on his porch, and for the first time in months, the tremor in his hands had completely stopped. 3 weeks later, his phone rang. The voice was professional, polite. "Mr. Riker, this is Principal Walsh from Little Creek Elementary. I was wondering if you might have some time to talk." "About what?" "Well, we've been thinking about updating our safety protocols. Emergency procedures, that sort of thing. Sarah Brennan suggested that you might be able to help us develop some training programs for our staff." "I could do that." The words came out before he could second-guess them. "When do you want to start?" A month later, Luke Riker stood in the Little Creek Elementary Gymnasium, facing a room full of teachers and staff members. His hands weren't shaking anymore. They never did when he had a job to do. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying clearly to the back of the room. "My name is Luke Riker, and I'm here to teach you how to keep your students safe." No one applauded. This wasn't that kind of gathering, but everyone paid attention, leaning forward in their chairs, notebooks open, ready to learn from a man who had earned the right to teach them. In the back of the room, Sarah Brennan smiled. Tommy was in class, drawing pictures of heroes and writing stories about brave strangers who appeared when people needed them most. Her son was alive because this quiet man had been willing to act when action was needed. Outside, the mountains of Montana stretched toward a sky that seemed wide enough to hold all the stories that mattered. And in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, Luke Riker had finally found his place. Not as the mysterious stranger on the ridge, but as the protector he'd always been, the guardian who stayed ready so others could sleep safely. He looked out over the faces of the teachers and staff, people who had entrusted him with their attention and their hopes. For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged somewhere. "Let's begin," he said, and they did. These stories matter because they remind us that heroes walk among us every day, often unseen and unrecognized. They're the quiet ones who served, who sacrificed, who still carry the weight of what they've done for all of us. If you believe these stories deserve to be told, if you want to honor the quiet heroes who shaped our world, please consider subscribing to Echo Bravo. Every subscription helps us continue sharing these stories that would otherwise be forgotten.